First, as bad as all this may look, let me reassure you, it can get much worse. First, it isn't the Chinese, it's the Chinese and the Russians that you may have to start thinking about. And what I mean by that is there was an old argument by Halliford Mackinder, Mr. Spikeman, that whoever has control of the Eurasian landmass is trouble for us. And if there is condominium that gets better between China and Russia, you roughly have that problem, which may be independent of force levels to some extent. So one thing that we're not going to talk about tonight, but I hope people start thinking about more and talking about, is what are the divergences and convergences of Chinese and Russian interests around the world, and to what extent can you keep them from getting closer together? I think there's something there. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but needs to be worked. So, second of all, we tend to focus in the arms control world about things that are Russian, followed by things that are Chinese. And in that world, we kind of like to look at what we can see most clearly, and that's usually what's going on in the next 5, maybe 10 years. And as difficult as it is to keep up with what we worry about in those realms, those things are measured still, for that time frame, in hundreds. Now, admittedly, we'll talk about how that might change, but I'm here to tell you it's worse than what he said. I think that if we're not careful, if we keep doing certain things in the name of peaceful nuclear energy with certain countries, we could see the potential for ramp-ups and breakouts measured in the case of China, not of hundreds, not of thousands, but of potentially at least 10 to 20,000 before the year 2040. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. I am going to tell you why we need to be concerned about it possibly happening. In the case of Japan and South Korea, they could break out, but not in onesies or twosies or tens, but hundreds. That's what I'm going to try to talk about, because I think we have some control over this. I told you I end on a little bit of an upbeat note. Yeah? First, different take, same numbers. If you take a look at what we think the stockpiles on hand for weapons, explosive, and uranium and plutonium are in China, they are distinctly less than Russia or the United States. Now, you can stack and rack what we have in, civilian stockpile and excess military material and stuff than weapons, but you can see that roughly the numbers are quite significantly weighted towards Russia and the United States. If you want to understand what those bar charts mean, tens of thousands of weapons capacity in potentia. Now, there are lots of reasons that's not easy to do overnight, but it's there in a way that it's not, at least for the moment, likely available in the case of the Chinese. However, one of the things that we do not pay much attention to when we do military assessments of China is their civil sector. It's pretty sporty. Now, it could be that they don't know how to multiply or add, but what they have in the way of enrichment capacity now, or certainly by next year, is, as our president would say, huge. And what I mean by huge is when you subtract what the light water reactors that they have running and likely to run from the totals that they're capable of producing with these enrichment plants, which came mostly from Russia, you get a delta that is roughly equivalent to 1,500 bombs worth of capacity, at least, if they choose to dedicate it, for making bombs. That's a big number. To give you some idea, that's roughly what the United States and Russia each have deployed in their strategic stockpile. That's a big number per year. Also, I might add, the projected growth of the Chinese nuclear power industry is starting to look like it won't happen as quickly or as big as people think. And we have a bit of a stake in that. I'll get to that in a moment. The most immediate and easiest way to bump up their plutonium stockpile are these two plants, which I might add are identical to plants in South Korea. You could bump up with these heavy water reactors without much effort, roughly about 100 bombs a year. That's interesting. This is more interesting. I always say that if you really want to do something right, go to the Americans. They'll help you. In this case, we have done a lot over the last 25 years to help the nuclear industry in China. I think too much, and I don't really think we got very much money for it. This is the Westinghouse AP1000 reactor. It's a bit of a cartoon because the power rating for that is a tad bit higher. I think it's 11 to 1200 megawatt electrical. I dumbed this down based on a Livermore chart to 1 gigawatt or 1,000. And what this shows is that for every one of these machines, you can go somewhere between, what is it? It says 37 to 48 bombs, depending on whether you use weapons or reactor grade. A lot of people like to make a whole lot about the difference between reactor and weapons grade. All I can say is that if you have weapons designs that are beyond that of what we had in 1950, you're kidding yourself. And I can assure you, the Chinese have more than that in the way of capability. So they could choose to use either, and it would effectively be the same size and the same amount of material with a super advanced design. But I went conservative on this. I said, oh, well, let's bias it that that's not the case. It's still an interesting number. Now, the reason I use this example is because these are 4 American reactors. At least we claim they're American. They came from Westinghouse. We'll come back to this, but we have a nuclear cooperative agreement with China. And we're supposed to have some say over whether they strip out this plutonium from the spent fuel. How the House and the Senate and the executive decide to interpret this agreement and implement it or telegraph how they're going to do it will matter a lot. Any guesses as to how many people in our government are thinking about this? You heard it first. I want that changed. You all have that assignment. We'll get back to that. They have roughly, what do we have on here? 42 gigawatts. Well, you can multiply 42 gigawatts. Now, the 42 gigawatts, all of it, but those 4 reactors are not clearly American. And I would say, arguably not at all. But we can get back to that, and we will at the end of this brief. Now, they do have a production problem, and the bottleneck is this. They really don't have a working reprocessing capacity. They got rid of what they had. It does not work. They're toying with something that works very badly, and there's a reason why they want to buy French. Now, luckily, the French are constantly in negotiations with these folks. Let's hope that continues, because when and if they start when they think they'd like to, in about 10 years' time, they could have roughly 15,000 bombs worth of separated plutonium. That is a big number. The argument is that they would want to use this in a fast breeder reactor. Now, I'm sure there's people here who are enthusiastic about nuclear power and some that aren't. Whatever the merits of conventional nuclear power are, you got to have your head examined to go invest in thinking you can make money or electricity effectively with a fast breeder reactor. But boy, does it make a lot of plutonium. The French and the Indians used their fast reactors for their bomb program. They knew what it was good for. Hard to believe this might not be used that way. So not only do you stockpile material for the fast breeder reactor, but once you get the fast breeder reactor going, you surround the core with a blanket of fertile U-238, and you make scads more plutonium. So this doesn't get better when you put the material in the fast breeder reactor. It gets worse. Okay, something I hope I have your attention on to watch. Luckily, the Chinese are sensible people. I'm talking about the people, maybe not the government. When they tried to locate this plant in the summer of 2016, 10,000 people rolled onto the street and said, "Not in my backyard." And what's interesting about even the communist government, and this is something where you want to take notes, they actually do pay attention to one form of protest, for sure, anti-nuclear protests. They back down. And partly the reason they back down is I had detailed seminars with them explaining the political consequences of Chernobyl. They get it. You could blow the entire regime and lose control politically if you take credit for doing something that's unsafe and it goes badly. So they're actually sensitive about this. Now, this is the tricky part. I mentioned that we have a little control with regard to the nuclear cooperative agreement with China. But there's more. Most people, when they think of Sun Tzu, they think about the paragraph and the first sentence of the paragraph that says, the best way to defeat your enemy is to destroy his confidence in his plans to defeat you, which is roughly defeat his strategy in his mind. Everybody in Washington, kind of like, I don't know, famous things that they say, will say this to one another, and everyone will think, you know, they read Sun Tzu. There is a second sentence, and the second sentence is that if you cannot succeed in doing that, the next best thing is to disrupt their alliances. I would submit that this is also, kind of like the point with Russia and China, something that needs more homework and study. We have two close allies in East Asia, besides Taiwan. We have South Korea and Japan. South Korea has almost every reason, looking at us, to be nervous. Perhaps a little more recently. A little bit, how should I put it? They've been nervous for a long time. They've tried to get bombs before. And they've done this kind of with a certain amount of regularity that suggests that it's not going away as an impulse. What would happen if our nuclear cooperative efforts with them, we have a nuclear cooperative agreement with South Korea, leads to them doing a fast reactor and recycling program of their own? And by the way, there's a study and an agreement to go with the recommendations of a study by a Department of Energy operation in Argonne. And what does Argonne do? Fast reactors and recycling. How do you think that study's going to go? Are they going to say, well, you know, maybe you shouldn't do that, even though we would like to do it and we can't get full funding to do it here? No, we are already talking about cooperating not only on that project in South Korea, but having them invest and pay attention to some fast reactor programs we have just begun to start up with House approval and Senate approval in this country. How does it work if they go ahead and recycle Will this be seen by the Chinese as a pretext to double down? Probably. But then there's a neighbor, and it's the Japanese. Oh, we have a nuclear cooperative agreement with them. We've been trying to persuade them not to open a large plant called Rakasho, which, surprise, surprise, is almost the identical plant the Chinese want to buy, because it's designed by the French, and it makes the same amount of material, about 1,500 bombs worth a year. Certainly, if the South Koreans edge in this direction, it's going to be very difficult to hold the Japanese back. If the Japanese go ahead, I can't imagine that the Chinese are going to say, well, you know, let's listen to the locals or let's listen to the economics. Okay, some suggestions. Now, some of this is woolly-headed, but we're up against something pretty big, so, you know, woolly-headed happens here. Some of it isn't. The Japanese have 47 tons of separated plutonium, 10 of which, at least, is on their own soil. The rest is in Europe. Now, if you divide 1,000 kilograms by 4 or 5, I'd say 5, that's a big number. You know, that is a very large number. Just for the 10 tons, it's 2,500 bombs worth. We have surplus plutonium here as a result of the debacle down in Savannah River. There's a MOX plant that never got seriously built, and now, to the credit of this administration and the end of the Obama administration, it's been unplugged. Maybe we ought to cooperate on Japan on how we're going to get rid of roughly the same amount of surplus material as they have. I don't know whether we are actively doing that. It has been suggested repeatedly by people like myself now for about 5 years. We could try to do that. It might be useful for everyone, including our own government, to be honest about the economics of fast reactors and recycling. I mean, you are going to, you know, you think vocal. Does anybody know what vocal is? A show of hands. You all need to know about that. The U.S. government is given a loan guarantee to a project to make 2 of these AP1000 reactors, which are now edging towards $30 billion in expense to complete. And we just expanded our loan guarantees, which is code for, you know, almost an interest-free loan, to $12 billion. Put that aside. We won't talk about that. Let's talk about something that is far worse, and that's the economics of fast reactors, which are several-fold worse than that. We need to be more honest about that. We're pushing the commercialization of fast reactors here and abroad still with these countries, Japan and Korea. We were doing it up until recently with China, but guess what? Someone, thankfully over the NSC, came to the conclusion that that was too risky and dangerous. But for some reason, it isn't with our allies. And so for some reason, we're going to get rich doing this. Maybe we need to be a bit more honest about that. Then, here's an idea. In the nuclear cooperative agreements, it says that the United States government has to be asked permission before you can recycle anything in the way of spent fuel from U.S. origin reactors. Does anybody know whether or not, does anybody know what the definition of a U.S. origin reactor is? No, you don't, and I'll tell you why. There is no definition. And why is that? Well, we like to defer to industry. This was actually testified by a top DOE official in the Senate 2 years ago. And so we let them define it. I would submit that maybe those days are behind us, that we ought to, as a government, sit down and at least begin to discuss what that might be. Why? Could a U.S. origin spent fuel, it's defined as coming from a U.S. origin reactor, be from a reactor that is designed in the U.S.? Well, that would be at least the AP1000. Could it be a reactor that has a key component from the U.S.? Oh, that's a larger number of reactors. Could it be a reactor that has a component that is borrowing from a U.S. design or uses a U.S. software package. You can go from no reactors to a big chunk of Chinese reactors, depending on how you define this. We need to perhaps think about that and also think about it in the case of the other two cases. Now we go to the woolly-headedness. By the way, those are eminently easy to do. Don't even cost money. You have to be honest, but we're capable of that. We've done that in the past. Promote a plutonium production pause in the U.S., China, Japan, and Korea. Effectively, at least a commercial one, excuse me, that needs to be clear. Effectively, that's what's happening right now. The question is, how much longer will it happen? We need to be vocal to at least say that's what we would like and get credit for not doing it ourselves. At least at this thing, you can fail. A lot of the other arms control things that we suggest, you can't even fail at. This, you should try, because if they won't agree to this, that tells you something. You should be more alarmed. Finally, East Asia Pacific moratorium on expanding uranium enrichment, or as my grandmother would say, enough already. More than enough. The enrichment capacity of the world needs to be kept to what the demand is more than we're doing. We have a superabundance of enrichment worldwide. If you include what the Russians and Europeans have, it's unbelievably beyond what's needed. And the proof of that is the price of enrichment services is at close to an all-time low. It's just too much of it. This is a work plan to at least test the system and at least address the problem, maybe not of the hundreds, but of the 10 to 20,000 or the hundreds that might erupt out of Japan or South Korea. And on these things, we do have a say. And we need to start thinking and talking about this.